idea of a course called Art versus Science, the crucial word being there, versus, is to suggest that interdisciplinarity isn't necessarily a collaborative endeavor, but if one looks at it historically, that it is a kind of intensive warfare between the different disciplines. In other words, every discipline or every mode of speaking about the world, whether it be poetry, painting, science, history, philosophy, all of these different ways of grasping at reality or the truth try and stake some claims about the way the world is. Now, of course, all of these claims can't be true at once. They could be true at once, but certainly one discipline won't be able to judge whether a claim in another discipline is true. So let's say a critic of poetry wouldn't be able to say whether or not a scientific theory is true or not, and similarly a scientist may not be able to sort of judge whether or not a poem speaks truly about the world or rings false in the ears. The way in which disciplines, compete with each other, or rather the way in which they interact with one another, is in a sort of imperialistic fashion, right? They try and say that the other ways there are some fundamental flaws in the other ways of talking about the world, and that my way of talking about the world is the true and the one right way. So let's say, for instance, a painter would say that, look, I'm showing you reality as it is. The other people are talking about things in different languages and different symbols, but I'm actually depicting to you the true nature of reality. A poet might say that I am taking very particular instances of a flower or a beautiful girl or whatever it is, and I'm telling you universal truths from those particulars. A historian might say, well, forget everything else. These are all speculative. The only thing that we know for a fact happened was the past, and I'm telling you about the past. A philosopher might say, the world has too many details. It's too messy. The only real way of thinking about the world is by thinking in abstraction, in generalities, taking all of these specifics and sort of sublating them into a generality. Or the scientists, on the other hand, might come and tell you, look, the only way of truly speaking about the world is through measurement and objectivity, and by studying the material world, with some instruments, we're able to come up with certain measurements that everybody can agree on is true. So there's a sort of communicability of ideas there. So these are all different claims about the truth of their own discipline, but there's no way of really assessing which one is truer than the other. We have a kind of a brief union between these different ways of talking about the world, simply because there are artists who are also poets, who are also architects, who are also scientists, from which we get the phrase the Renaissance man, who is able to do everything. So because they can do everything, they have no need to compete with the other fellow or the other person who does something else. So for instance, in the Renaissance, let's say, Shakespeare might tell you that my view of the world is like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, yea, the globe itself and all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded shall dissolve and not leave a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and this little life is rounded with a sleep. At the same time, you have someone like Michelangelo at the same time giving you a sense of purpose of creation, right? He's saying that, look, the body is coming from the earth, and then it's being given the spirit to you, that famous image of the two fingers of God and Adam meeting, and you also have the sort of the nude Christ in the Last Judgment, kind of like a sort of reassertion of physical existence against all the forces around one. So these are in some ways opposite views of the world, but they're being expressed in different mediums, and different mediums are telling you different things about the world, but it's okay because both can be true at once and both could coexist. In the 17th century, you have the great philosophers like Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, René Descartes, all sort of almost suggesting that the only real way of talking about the world is through science, and that, you know, that language in some ways is a very slippery thing, and one must try and have a very direct language where one says one word and one means exactly what that word means, and any kind of play with language, any kind of play with images is a form of lying, basically. So metaphors are lies is the sort of, let's say, the central theme that goes through all of these philosophers of the 17th century, and essentially saying that, look, poets, really what they're doing is they're dazzling you with all these metaphors, but they're all lies. What I am doing as a scientist is taking an object, measuring it, and telling you exactly how that object will behave, and that's all that you need to know. And in many ways, these are ideas that culminate in the great figure of Isaac Newton, who seems to have discovered the way in which the material world works in a way that no other scientist before him had. But then once we move on to the 18th century, we find that in fact all the poets and painters and the artists are actually accepting this view of the world, implicitly accepting it. For example, poets talk of light as if it were a spectrum of different colors as opposed to the single light that we actually see, which is an idea that Newton puts forward. We find that in paintings of the 18th century, the great Dutch masters of the Golden Age remove all angels and all supernatural and philosophical ideas from paintings and simply present nature as it is. They have these large skyscapes and these sort of high vantage from which they present the beholder a particular landscape in its plainness, as if a scientist were looking at it. Now, coming to the 19th century, we have a scenario wherein the romantic sort of movement begins, and it completely rebels against the dominance of science, right? You have someone like William Blake who reasserts the importance of the body. He says, look, you have your instruments are feeble little gadgets that you play with. My instrument is my body. I understand the world through my body, and thereby I have a richer understanding of the entirety of existence, not just these little measurables that you get and these ideas that you have in your head, but I perceive the body in a more fundamental and primal way. And he depicts this idea throughout his poems and his paintings, where he says that, you know, art is the tree of life and science is the tree of death. This is a famous line from Blake. What he means is that art depicts life as life. When you have a painter drawing a bird, the bird is alive and flying. It's being observed in its life form with its life energy, and it's being shown to you as it is. Whereas the scientist takes the bird into the laboratory, slices it open, and studies life, the biosphere through death, is what Blake actually means by that. You have the fact that the Newtonian world comes to a kind of completion in the 19th century, because Newton's world was based on many abstractions like absolute space, absolute time, and these ideas are questioned by the philosophers. The Newtonian world is also based on Euclidean geometry, for instance, and non-Euclidean geometry comes and kind of destroys that foundation of Newton. And for a brief period, it seems as if the different faculties are on par again, until Einstein and quantum mechanics come in the 20th century and again displace the balance of power, and science again begins to assert a kind of dominance. And by this time, the daily lives of people through the Industrial Revolution and the rise of technology has come to determine so much of their physical existence. Take this idea, right, that at the center of the different disciplines and interdisciplinarity is a fight, not a collaboration, and take it to all kinds of different places that this course hasn't explored, like the role of film in the Soviet Union, for instance. And essentially, one can use this to think about interdisciplinarity in a completely different way. So that was the purpose of the course Art versus Science.